Hi, Danielle. I will just introduce you and we can begin our panel. I will talk in Portuguese here for the audience and explain the translation device for them. And then we do your presentation, okay? Bom, senhoras e senhores, meu nome é Otto, eu sou gerente sênior de comunicação e relações institucionais na Glogold Achante e é um prazer mediar esse painel e vamos dando sequência ao nosso evento. O painel é denominado Pesquisa Mundial, os impactos da covid-19 em territórios da mineração e teremos conosco a Daniela Martin do ICMM. Esse painel ele será em inglês, então quem desejar acompanhá-lo em português, estiver conectado aqui online com a gente, é só clicar em Interpretation e ali escolhe o idioma que quer escutar, ou no original em inglês, ou no português. Apresentando a nossa apresentadora é a Danielle Martin, diretora de desempenho social do ICMM, que é o International Council on Mining and Metals. Ela ingressou na ICMM em setembro de 2020 e lidera a iniciativa Skills for Our Common Future, um programa aspiracional de 15 anos que visa acelerar os esforços nacionais e regionais para construir novas e reforçar as habilidades existentes que são necessárias para impulsionar a economia inclusiva, participativa e de diversificação para além da mineração. Danielle trabalhou anteriormente para empresas e consultorias por mais de 20 anos nas áreas de desempenho social, com foco no envolvimento de partes interessadas, desenvolvimento comunitário e econômico, além de avaliação e medição de impacto social. Daniela tem experiência na liderança de engajamento de projetos de infraestrutura de grande escala e assessorou questões de desempenho social para governos, agências de desenvolvimento e organizações sem fins lucrativos. Possui mestrado em desenvolvimento sustentável e bacharelado em mídia e comunicação, além de certificados em desenvolvimento econômico, liderança executiva, participação pública e auditoria de sistemas de gestão. Danielle, please, our kind welcome here from Brazil. We are looking forward to see your presentation. Please be our guest.
Hello, thank you everybody. It's lovely to see you all, and thank you for having me at the event today. My name is Danielle Martin. I'm the Director for Social Performance at ICMM. I know you just heard that. Let me first say just a few quick words about ICMM by way of introduction. ICMM, as you heard, stands for the International Council on Mining and Metals. And we are an international organisation that's dedicated to safe, fair and sustainable mining and metals. We bring together 27 mining and metals companies and more than 35 regional and commodity associations to serve as a catalyst for change, strengthening environmental and social performance and enhancing mining's contribution to society. ICMM is quite a unique industry body in that we're not a lobby group or a trade association, but rather a global leadership organisation for sustainable development. That was what we were set up to be. We judge our success by our contribution to creating a safe, just and sustainable world through responsibly produced metals and minerals. Each of our company members, which together account for 1/3 of the global industry, promise to work collaboratively with each other, with associations and with other stakeholders to enhance the contribution of mining and metals to sustainable development. It was this spirit of collaboration with each other and with local communities, government and civil societies that the industry responded to COVID-19. But I'll come to that in just a moment. First, let me talk a little bit about how COVID impacted the mining industry. COVID has undoubtedly been the defining global health crisis of our time, with both governments and businesses having to adapt rapidly while addressing the challenges of managing public health, revitalising the economy, and rebuilding towards a better future. For the mining and metals industry, as well as many others, it came at a time when disruption within the industry was already occurring, with automation and digitisation, climate change, resource stewardship, and increasing stakeholder expectations, amongst other things, driving changes to its fundamental ways of doing business. Around the world, COVID has impacted on economies, employment, supply chains, health and education services, our sense of safety, and the trust we have in governments, among many other things. And while the world, indeed all of us, struggled to know how to respond, what was immediately clear was that not only was this a health crisis, but it was also a social and economic one too, and particularly poignant in our regional communities. I just want to focus for a moment on the impact on women. We can't lose sight of the fact that even without a global pandemic, women in mining communities are disproportionately affected by the negative impacts of mining, with lesser opportunity for a range of reasons to benefit from, for example, the jobs generated by mining. COVID has made the climb to gender equality in mining even steeper. COVID has led to the first global rise in extreme poverty since 1998. We've seen the loss of an estimated 155 million jobs, full-time jobs, with disproportionate impacts on women workers who have been 1.8 times more vulnerable than men to unemployment or underemployment caused by the economic impacts of COVID-19. This is because of the type of jobs that women are often employed in are less secure, and that unpaid care work, so childcare, homeschooling, etc., often fell mainly to women. We've seen a shocking rise in domestic violence during lockdowns. And so the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic have undoubtedly fallen on women, but also on youth, on the self-employed, and on low and medium skilled workers, all of which points to the risk of an uneven recovery, leading to still greater inequality in the coming years. COVID has also accelerated a number of trends that are material to how we build forward better. Technological innovation and its impact on skills has been one trend. We've undoubtedly seen the more rapid adoption of technology to de-densify mining operations for health and safety reasons, to drive efficiency and productivity, and that have enabled us to work in new and different ways. This has been called the fourth industrial revolution. And with COVID and the remote working it drove, it came a whole lot closer. The World Economic Forum estimates that by 2025, the rate for deployment of new automated equipment in the mining sector will be 25% compared to just 0.1% in 2017. So this transformation could lead to better, safer work, higher paying jobs, and improved quality of life. But it also risks widening the existing skills gaps and increasing inequality. It's assumed that almost 50% of existing employees will require reskilling or upskilling to deliver the mining company of the future. This transition to the future of mining, set within a much broader disruptive transition to the technology-enabled future of work, could be a huge opportunity for the industry, or it could perpetuate the barriers that currently exist. What COVID has shown us are amazing examples of collaboration between previously unfamiliar and seemingly unusual partners that have been evident throughout the pandemic. It's maybe one of the very few silver linings of what have been very difficult times. Collaboration between business and industry leaders, communities, governments, and local stakeholders will remain critical well into the future as we continue to respond, recover, and eventually build forward towards a brighter future. This is acutely true within the mining industry. The industry's response to the crisis was swift and aligned, and companies worked really hard to protect the health and safety of workers and local communities, as well as providing additional assistance to support livelihoods for those most in need. This has been of critical importance in countries where local government capacity was quickly overwhelmed. What has been abundantly clear throughout the pandemic is that mining companies are uniquely connected to the lives and the prospects of the often remote communities in which they operate. In many cases, the response of mining companies through COVID has drawn on the deep fundamental relationships that they have built with these communities over generations. Long established trust and respect in these relationships has been key in getting help to the most vulnerable most quickly. So I want to talk a little bit about what we call the Building Forward Better framework, and I hope some of you have seen that already. And in fact, I could post a link to everyone in the chat of our original version, and I'll talk more about that in a second. There we go. So the Building Forward Better framework was what we as a mining industry initially or developed initially in response to the pandemic. In the earlier part of the pandemic, so the first half of 2020, ICMM convened its members, so mining companies that collectively operate more than 650 assets in more than 50 countries, and our association members, to share emerging challenges and to share early lessons in their responses to the pandemic. So in countless video conference calls, the underlying questions were, how can we improve our immediate response? What comes next? And how can we get ready? So we developed a framework to respond to those questions and challenges that we called the Building Forward Better framework. It captures the lessons, the case studies, and the insights that were shared by ICMM's company and association members to provide what we hope is a really practical guide for mining companies and businesses in other sectors to review and use to strengthen their own responses. The framework also encouraged thinking about mining's collective role in supporting long-term community resilience post-COVID-19. The framework provided learnings from the interactions companies had had with local communities, alongside insight into the way the industry worked with and supported local authorities, and how it was guided by a strong health and safety culture. It identified 3 key areas for action, and they were lives, which related to health and safety, livelihoods, which of course related to jobs and income, and learning, which related to education and skills. And within those 3 areas, more than 90 actions that companies could take were identified, illustrated with more than 60 examples from the mining sector. So just to reflect on a few of those examples, Anglo Gold Ashanti and Goldfields, Harmony and Sibanye-Stillwater, those companies, joined together to launch an awareness campaign to inform and empower mining employees and communities on issues related to COVID. They called it "This is Gold," and members recognised the need to collaborate in order to broaden the reach and amplify the COVID-19 educational messaging across those communities. The campaign aimed to address stigmatisation of COVID-19 sufferers, but to also address gender-based violence and to encourage responsible behaviour under lockdown regulations. Goldfields also created a public COVID-19 portal. So it was a portal that was open to all stakeholders, and it acted as a repository for information, including links to government and national health COVID sites. At its South Deep mine in South Africa, it developed a video in 4 local languages on how to educate children about the virus. And it also partnered with other mining companies to run a national radio campaign, educating host communities and addressing issues of domestic violence and stigmatisation. Another company, Rio Tinto, committed funding towards the upskilling of out-of-work apprentices across various industries by covering their fees for a course in automation. What this did was it allowed for the enrolment of up to 200 apprentices who had their apprenticeships either suspended or cancelled due to COVID-19. Freeport-McMoRan, at their Cerro Verde operations in Peru, provided buses to ferry healthcare workers after public transport was halted. And they contributed also towards the purchase of 500,000 test kits and 10 non-invasive CPAP ventilators. Newmont established a $20 million community support fund to help host communities, governments, and employees combat the pandemic. The fund prioritised health, but it also contributed to economic recovery and stability among small and medium enterprises in host communities. There are many more examples in the framework, but I'll pause there for a moment. The framework also included high-level guidance on how to prioritise and collaborate within and across sectors, linking to 20 further practical resources where readers could find out more. As some of you I'm sure will know, the framework has since been translated into several other languages and been tailored with examples specific to particular regions, including being translated into Portuguese by IBRAM. What became clear out of this exercise was the critical importance of collaboration between business and industry leaders, communities, governments, and local stakeholders. The framework helped accelerate learning amongst them and helped to take responses to scale, often by bringing unusual partners together. We think the framework was both an example in itself of a valuable collaboration and also a tool to support collaborative action within the industry, across industries, and more broadly towards building long-term resilience. Now, I want to talk quickly about resilience and the role of diversity, equity, and inclusion in resilience. But before I move away from the Building Forward Better framework, I wanted to mention that it was a collaborative effort between ICMM, between our member companies and associations, and between an organisation called Business Fights Poverty that worked with the Harvard Kennedy School's Corporate Responsibility Initiative to develop a similar framework that we tailored our framework from. And we also worked with an organisation called the Partnering Initiative to create the mining industry version of this framework. So for their input into that process, we are very grateful. So since then, since the development of the framework, and as we've continued to deal with the effects of the COVID pandemic, ICMM and its members have been looking forward to longer-term sustainable resilience. We've embarked on a 15-year aspiration called Skills for Our Common Future, or Skills Initiative for short, which responds directly to mining's long-term contribution to the resilience of local communities. The Skills Initiative supports ICMM member companies in strengthening community and local economic resilience through skills building and reskilling in the regions around the operations. It responds to a profound need that we identified over many years working with stakeholders and partners around the world for communities where our members operate to prosper and thrive through disruptions of our rapidly changing world. So disruptions including economic transitions such as mine closures, or conversely, the move to more technological automated mines of the future, to things like climate change and the energy transition, and to other significant and disruptive events such as natural disasters, political upheavals, and of course, given we were in the middle of one during our thinking, pandemics. The Skills Initiative will be developed and implemented over the next 15 years, such that every mining asset from all of our members can participate. So that's more than 650 assets in more than 50 countries, and our association members. So we think this will have a huge impact and drive a step change in the way mining contributes to the resilience of communities going forward. And then lastly, a word on diversity, equity, and inclusion and its role in contributing to community and societal resilience. So I gave some examples before of the inequalities faced by women. And this is also true, of course, for people of colour, people with different sexual preferences, people with disabilities, and others. And just to say, and likely partly because of the experience the industry had during COVID and its desire to look to long-term resilience, which was highlighted by the Building Forward Better exercise, we at ICMM this year have also committed to a dedicated project on diversity, equity, and inclusion in mining and in mining communities. Diversity, equity, and inclusion remain an enduring challenge for our sector and society at large, as evidenced by troubling findings on workplace culture and practices in the mining and metals sector. Our work will focus on identifying systemic barriers to the creating of truly diverse and inclusive cultures within the industry. And we'll also explore the opportunity to establish a cross-industry group to champion these efforts globally, working with appropriate partners in each individual operating context. I'll stop there now, I think, and perhaps invite questions. But just to say that those were the big enduring lessons that came from the industry out of the COVID pandemic and our response. And to say that community resilience, longer term, and diversity, equity, and inclusion as a key component of that have now become pivotal and central areas of focus for us and our members going forward. So I'll pause there and perhaps invite any questions or comments.
Thank you, Danielle, for your presentation, and I invite everyone to post your questions on the chat or make it here in the audience. But until we receive them, I'd like to ask a couple of questions. First, Danielle, I would like a comment on your site, thinking globally, and of course the framework sets some global challenges or global approach of the mining sector in terms of building a sustainable future. But I would like a comment on you about localization, how these aspects are different in countries such as Canada or Africa or South America, how you see those different aspects of the same subject on different countries.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what we found was that essentially many of the issues were very similar, but they transpired in different ways in different locations. And it was often to do with the baseline resilience of communities and the capacity of governments and other institutions to support those communities. So where kind of health implications were more, or where economic implications were greater, was usually where government capacity was overwhelmed and where there were not those other support mechanisms for communities, which is what got us thinking more about community resilience, and where maybe once upon a time we had focused our efforts in particular areas in a community, maybe in health, maybe in education, maybe in local business development. Actually, we got to thinking that in fact it's all of those pieces in collaboration with local governments, local communities, local service providers, local civil service organisations that would contribute to ongoing broader resilience, and thus assist communities and those organisations to not just withstand disruptions like pandemics, but actually be able to prosper and thrive through those disruptions.
Thank you very much, Danielle. And we have a question here from the audience. It's Raquel, which is Anglo-American Communication Manager.
Hello, Danielle. It's very nice hearing your inputs from the framework. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
My question comes from your inputs among how COVID-19 impacted and has been impacting, in fact, minorities, especially when it comes to women and young women. When we reflect this in Brazil, it's a huge impact, especially because more than 50% of housekeepers and people that are responsible for their homes are women here in Brazil. How do you see from the framework perspective that the mining sector could move forward the agenda of including more women, not only in the operational sides, but also in the leadership aspect?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And it's a really great question. And it's why I wanted to talk specifically about COVID and the impact on women earlier in my presentation and in our piece on diversity, equity and inclusion. Because certainly, exactly to your point, even before COVID-19, women in mining communities were disproportionately affected by the negative impacts of mining. And women in the mining industry, we were finding it very hard to progress through the industry, through their career and into leadership positions. Women were being recruited, but then we had a leaky pipeline, so they were not advancing up to senior levels within organisations for a number of reasons. But often driven by workforce cultures, organisational cultures that were more aligned with men workers than with women workers, and that did not provide potentially the flexibility or the recognition that the majority of the burden of unpaid work falls to women. And of course, women have many more obligations outside work. And then, of course, as I mentioned, there was the compounding impacts of a huge rise in domestic violence that we saw come out of people being in lockdown, during the pandemic. So at ICMM, we think about that in a couple of different ways. One way is the fact that COVID has really shone a spotlight on the inequalities that already existed, but that became more severe in the pandemic. So a real focus. We've also started to think about the potential benefits of technology and automation for women in mining, because in many respects, more automation and greater technology potentially creates more opportunity for women, for again, many different reasons, such as, the kind of automation of more heavy work, but right through to the flexibility that technology might provide to women in terms of flexible hours of work, or even flexible locations for work, potentially making it easier for them to balance work and home commitments. So that's the second way. And then we have, through our diversity, equity and inclusion program that I talked about, which is actually new this year. So we've always had diversity, equity and inclusion, and particularly gender, built into our existing programs. But this year, and for the next strategy cycle at ICMM, which is the next 3 years, we have a dedicated focus on diversity, equity and inclusion, and particularly women. And that will look at both the implications in the workforce for women. It'll look at the implications in mining communities for women, and the negative impacts of mining, and the opportunities that might come from mining, and how they can be more equitably shared with women. And it'll also look at these systemic barriers that women face in the industry and society more broadly. So just to say, absolutely, the COVID pandemic has given us really clear focus on the impacts of women, and we've been able to kind of respond with these 3 initiatives that I spoke of. Sorry, I should just add one more thing to that, and that is that, the benefit of ICMM and its member organisations, so companies and associations, is that power of collaboration and scale. So, we know that our association members are doing a lot of work in a lot of countries around, women in the industry, and the impacts of COVID and of mining and of inequality on women in communities. And then similarly, as I've mentioned already, the impact of having 27 companies representing 1/3 of global mining, with 650 assets on 50 countries, thinking about issues related to gender and broader diversity, equity and inclusion, we think will have or has the potential to have a very big impact on how we think and act and organise ourselves organisationally to be more equitable.
Thank you, Danielle. I would like you to comment on, of course, the pandemic was an unexpected event, a black swan, as some would say. And none of the companies had a previous plan detailed for it, and the actions came as the pandemic were happening. And I think it was a great example that no company, no organization is an island. We as a society are all interconnected. So all the social actions and all the partnerships and the collaboration initiatives gained a highlight during this period. So my question is, looking forward in a post-pandemic world, what will be the lessons and the consolidated transformations that will drive the world in this new period? What are your main insights on that?
Yeah, really good question. Because of course, there is a competitive space that mining companies exist in, of course, and it means as a result that they are not always in a position to be able to collaborate and to share learnings. But certainly with the pandemic and as is demonstrated with the Building Forward Better framework, companies absolutely, they had no concern. There was no competitiveness in that process. And to your point, everyone was asking or was wondering how to respond. Nobody knew the answers, in the early days of the pandemic. And of course, it became very quickly obvious that, everybody could learn from everybody else in the sector. And so as one company started to take action and see what worked and potentially what didn't work, then the next company was able to learn from that and adapt their strategies, and the next one again. And it just accelerated the action that companies could take. Whereas if they were aiming to achieve such actions on their own, they would not have been able to move so quickly, but from the benefit of collaboration and learning and accelerating their learning. So I think it's really interesting in terms of a question for what does this mean going forward. I feel like there is real recognition within the industry of the power of learning, of collaborating, and of accelerating, particularly in those areas where there is no competitive kind of advantage, or that in fact maybe what areas may have traditionally have been seen as being competitive or competitive advantage, actually through this, companies have seen that the advantage is not in the competition, it is in the collective and the collaboration. And so I think it's probably carved out greater areas and more opportunities for companies to collaborate going forward. And even if I think about the work program at ICMM, in particular the skills initiative, which is all about community resilience, you can see how in mining regions, particularly where there is more than one company operating in a region, they will not be as successful on their own in contributing to community resilience as they will be if they collaborate. I mean, the other thing I would say is that through the exercise, through the pandemic and through the exercise of the Building Forward Better framework, was acknowledgement of the importance of partnering with others to respond to the pandemic. And one of the big learnings was that if a relationship didn't exist, then it was very hard to partner quickly and effectively. And so I think there is much greater importance being placed on establishing and maintaining relationships and identifying where those relationships can result in partnerships to accelerate or optimize action.
Thank you, Danielle. We have another question. Raquel, please.
It's me again.
Welcome back.
During this morning and yesterday, we've been debating within the academy professors that are here with us, especially the transparency and governance aspects in the mining sector, and everything that we have to pay attention, listening our publics, especially the communities impacted on our sites. From your research and your experience, how can we scale up this mindset that society is requesting more and more from us to be more open and to listen more, taking into consideration that we have different sizes of companies and different levels of maturities among the boards and the decision-making process? Thank you.
Yeah, again, such a good question. That's entirely the experience that that we hear every day at ICMM. It's this experience of stakeholders, and I mean the broad spectrum of stakeholders, from investors to analysts to all sorts, government organizations, non-government organizations, communities. There is this overwhelming request or demand even of the industry to be much more transparent about both its impacts and its benefits. But I think there are some interesting points about that, and one which was raised in the question, and that is that the response to this increase in expectation around disclosure or transparency has been, in many respects, the addition of more and more and more requirements for companies to disclose, and so that has the effect of, on the company side, almost an overwhelming or an overwhelm from companies trying to keep pace with all of the different requirements of different stakeholders that they need to meet for disclosure. But on the other hand, it also potentially puts sort of a lot of information into the public domain that is not necessarily meaningful, it's not necessarily comparable, it's not necessarily trackable over time, and so its value is potentially not as good as it should be. And so I feel like, in a sense, we're caught up in a problem of quantity and not quality. So there's a few things, I guess, that that ICMM certainly is doing to try and help its member companies with these issues. For example, in this new strategy, we have a program of work that aims to look across all of the various reporting and measurement standards that exist for the industry, that many of our companies fulfill or conform to actually see if we can consolidate and identify a better set of metrics or a better reporting framework that improves the quality of information that is disclosed, so that it is more comparable, it is understood better by the stakeholder that is requesting it, it is trackable over time. So there is this consolidation process that we are thinking about at the moment. But then there's some other initiatives as well, including a framework actually that we are about to launch out of ICMM that has been developed over a couple of years now, with the help of our member companies and associations and a host of external stakeholders. And what it does is looks across all the reporting requirements for companies and consolidates those requirements down into one core set of indicators that all of our member companies will be required to report on. And what that will do will be, hopefully on the company side, will help companies to focus down on one set and not on a plethora, but it'll also help communities and other stakeholders be better able to track the social and economic contributions of mining over time and in comparison with other companies. And then there are other things too that I should mention. So for example, in our mineral resource governance stream of work, just recently there has been some significant developments with regards to things like contract disclosure. So all of our member companies now are required to disclose the arrangements of their contracts so that they are, they are transparent also out there. And so I guess, to answer the question, there is this thing about quantity, there is this thing about quality, and there is this thing about making sure the expectations and drivers for transparency and disclosure are actually contributing to better performance by the industry and not in fact kind of detracting from that by nature of the volume of expectation or the volume of transparency requirements that stakeholders expect. And look, also maybe a final point is that there is undoubtedly a role for the industry to help other stakeholders, some of whom are driving the demands for greater disclosure, to help them better understand what these metrics mean, what our reporting means, so that they know what information to ask for, or what information gives them more insight into our material issues or our material risks or impacts. And by educating or by helping those stakeholders to understand that, then again we might get away from the quantity and we might get more aligned on the quality of disclosures, so that stakeholders really understand, our impacts, our contributions, etc.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you again for your answer, Danielle. And we have another question. We are almost on our time, but Paulo Henrique from IBRA wants to ask you.
Oh, thank you, Otto. Thank you, Danielle. If you could give us one lesson learned from this pandemic for the relationship with communities for the mining sector, what would that be?
Oh, okay, one lesson. I think I would have to say that it's, again, I feel like I might have said this already, but I think the lesson was about relationships, existing relationships and partnerships. So I think if you asked across our member companies, you would find that those companies that had strong existing relationships were able to mobilize action around the pandemic much more easily and much more effectively. So I guess because of those ongoing existing relationships, companies were better able to know what needs existed in the company, in communities, or how best the companies could support communities. whether that be through kind of direct support or whether that be through kind of leveraging mining's infrastructure or activities or mining's relationship with other stakeholders who could potentially provide the support that was required. But where other companies perhaps didn't have those existing relationships, then obviously it was harder for them to know where best to provide support. And even if they could identify that, obviously it was harder for them to then mobilize that action. So, I think it's been just a really interesting reminder of the importance of, strong, trust-based, deep relationships between mining and communities. But also to say, I guess, just on that, and we absolutely saw it, that, because of the remote nature of mining, and therefore that those communities are often also very remote. It's often the case that mining companies, exist with communities in the absence of governments, of other infrastructure, of other support, and so really, in a sense, it was that thing about because of the remoteness, those long established trusted and respectful relationships, were absolutely key in identifying the right kinds of support and then being able to mobilize action quickly.
Thank you, Danielle. We are just on our time here for our lunch break. I don't know your time zone, but I would like to thank you so much for your words and your thoughts and reflections. And in the name of the organization, thank you so much. And for us guys here in Brazil, we're doing our lunch break, and we will be back at 1:30, right? Okay. So thank you again, Danielle, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Algum aviso para o que é? 1:30 de volta. Pessoal, quem está nos acompanhando aí no online, vamos fazer agora o pausa para o almoço. 1:30 a gente está de volta com as apresentações dos grupos de trabalho. Obrigado a todos que acompanharam e até mais.